Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast. I'm here with Phil Batterson, PhD. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Ross, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm excited actually to go and dig into some more of your podcast topics and stuff like that. I did a cursory glance and I've saved some, so I need to listen to some on my long run. But for those of you who don't know me, my name's Phil Batterson. I'm a PhD in exercise physiology. I did my PhD actually with a focus in molecular exercise physiology, specifically focusing on how our mitochondria adapt to dietary and exercise interventions. And previous to that, I did a master's degree that focused on predictors of endurance performance. If you've ever been into a lab or if you've ever looked at your Garmin watch, everyone's obsessed with VO2 max nowadays. But what we were looking at, the different things, the different variables that actually make a good endurance athlete. The really interesting thing is that you can have all of these like lab values, VO2 max, FTP or second threshold and economy, and they don't even stack up to the predictive ability of your mitochondria. So if you can measure how good your mitochondria are using oxygen, then that predicts more performance compared to all three of those big predictors. But we don't have a good way of measuring mitochondrial function quite yet without doing a muscle biopsy. So that's a little bit further down the road. So we'll just have to keep using VO2 max and all those sort of variables. I'm a runner by happenstance. Just turns out I was a good runner, in junior high, and that's all. So then you kind of start to love the things that you're good at. Ever since then, it's kind of been a love-hate relationship because I train for a little bit, then I get injured, and then I do too much, and then I get injured, and it's been back and forth. So I've kind of been on this ever since I graduated with my PhD 2 years ago now. I've been on this quest to stay healthy and stay consistent and train more. And through that learning, not only the experiential learning, but the academic learning, I'm now coaching endurance athletes of all types. So everybody from, kind of like you're just like amateur age group athlete, elite level, mountain bikers, everybody in between. I've trained trail runners, road cyclists, mountain bikers, and even surf skiers, some other endurance sports. So it's been really fun. And I'm planning on continuing to build that, coaching business out as I go forward.
Amazing. Yeah. And what made you go from PhD, which is like heavily, in the lab, academic, to coaching and
Mm-hmm.
working with others directly?
Yeah, I kind of had like a quarter life crisis after my undergrad. My undergrad's actually in mechanical engineering, and I got my first job, and then I sat in a cubicle for 6 months, and I was like, oh, I cannot handle this. I'm the type of person, you can see my hands moving around if you're watching on video. I'm also kind of like swinging in my chair. I like to move, and I always had this kind of like obsession with like making myself better from like an endurance perspective. And eventually, I kind of figured out, I was like, I'd really like to be like an endurance coach or something along those lines, but I didn't feel qualified. So I did my master's degree, and then still didn't really feel qualified, or maybe felt a little bit of imposter syndrome or something along those lines. So then did my PhD. And I realized through all of that, doing the research is an extremely important job. It wasn't really for me. Like I really thrived in the clinical human exercise, sort of physiology lab where we were bringing people in. I was training them for, doing high intensity interval training during my PhD. And I really liked that face-to-face interaction, that person-to-person connection. And then, like getting into the lab, it just was one of those things where I was like, it's great to learn, but other people who really, really like this stuff do that. And on top of that, I really wanted to use everything that I learned and apply it to help people. That's always been kind of like my driving thing, is like, how can I help people by imparting the knowledge by coaching, essentially. So what I'm trying to do now, right, is merge that academic learning, bridge the gap between, kind of like the art and science of coaching, and use my platform not only to coach individual, like, coach endurance athletes, but also teach coaches, like about principles of endurance development, what sort of technology we can use and what we can learn from academia, and then what we kind of have to, learn from an experiential coaching side of things.
Got it. Yeah, I totally get helping others. And I think, it's cool when I set a PR myself, but if I can help someone else to PR, I think it's kind of just like, it's just like a double like whammy. It's like so much better. So I get that completely. So yeah, you've mentioned endurance a lot. So can you just kind of break it down and just kind of, so here in San Francisco, me and a colleague of mine, Darush Abadat, we have a progression run club that we lead, and we focus on half marathons and marathons. So basically endurance training and running. So can you just kind of break down what is good endurance, or what is someone with a good endurance? Like, is it a high VO2 max, or does it mean that they can run an ultra marathon? In simple terms, I know you
Yeah.
could really go into the weeds, and then how do people improve that?
Yeah, so I think from a really, really high level perspective, like what I would define as endurance is your ability to do a repetitive task over the distance or the time required for whatever race you're doing. And, so good endurance then is different depending on the task you're doing. If you're a miler, endurance can be really anything from, like probably like 2 minutes out. Like I would say, it's like you start to get a little bit, kind of into like this gray area with like maybe an 800-meter runner? Like, are they a sprinter or are they an endurance athlete? Well, they're probably a little bit of both, because you have the 400-meter runners who can kind of bump up to 800, or you have a 1500-meter runner that can go down, to 800. So really anything above that. And then endurance is, from like maybe a performance perspective, it's how fast you can get across the finish line. So, like a good endurance for a 5K runner is going to mean something totally different than good endurance for a marathoner, right? Who has to be out there for 20 hours or, something along those lines. And from that perspective, I think to some extent we almost like do like it a little bit of a disservice by trying to, say, oh, well, these are all endurance sports, because the requirements, I just made a post the other day that was like, oh, if you're doing exercise at like zone 1 or zone 2, it's probably not going to make you faster if your race is in, zone 3, 4, and 5. And then I had, of course, a lot of like trail runners and ultra athletes who were like, well, wait a minute, like, what if my race is actually at zone 1 and zone 2? I was like, exactly. It'll definitely make you better, if you're running a lot of zone 1 and zone 2, if you're an ultra athlete. But if you're just doing zone 1, zone 2, you can't expect to get the most out of, say a 5K run. So that was a long-winded way of basically saying, like endurance is like the requirement. How fast can you get across the finish line depending on the distance or the time that you're supposed to be racing? And it's highly variable then, across the spectrum. All these crazy things that we do now and call races. Ultra marathon races weren't a thing when I was growing up doing cross country, like in, I don't know, 2008. Maybe they were and I just wasn't aware of it. But like that was before like the Born to Run book came out and like all this other stuff. And I think like after that, it kind of got more mainstream. And now people are like, people come to me, they're like, oh yeah, I'm training for 142K. I'm like, oh my, I'm like, let's just like start with like a 42K, which I think is a marathon,
It is,
and then
yeah.
go from there. But yeah, people, like the 240-mile race out nowadays. And it's like that. I mean, at the very, very heart of it, right? That's what I think a lot of people think endurance acts, just like this ability to just go and maintain some level of movement for forever.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I had a buddy who's like into running and he's like training for an endurance run. And then he's like, yeah, I just did my long endurance run. It took 24 hours. I'm like, how is that like the norm now? How are people like casually just, I don't know what's going on in the world these days,
Yeah.
but so are you saying then that endurance is event specific? So someone can't be like a good endurance athlete across the board. Typically, it's more like, okay, you have your good Moab 240 endurance athlete, you have your good mile endurance athlete. Is that it's specific to the event?
I think so. I think, and this is a really good question. I hadn't really actually like, thought about it too much until now. But yeah, I think, and we see it, right? We don't see the miler, the Olympic level miler going and winning the Olympic marathon. But I would say that both of those athletes are extremely talented endurance. So actually, and then like going a little bit further, you said, well, what predicts, like the ability to do that endurance? Well, that also depends on what event you're doing. So if you're a miler, the requirement for a mile is very, very high intensity for a little bit of a shorter period of time. So you need incredibly high VO2 max in order to run a sub 4 minute mile or, like something. Whereas for an ultra marathoner, you don't really need that high of a VO2 max because your entire race is probably zone 1, zone 2, maybe, like these really, really good elites that are doing, like Hard Rock 100 and those sort of races, maybe zone 3. But the requirement, and they do have a high VO2 max, but it's not nearly as high, as like the best milers. And I'm not saying that one variable is going to predict everything. It's a combination, but I would say it changes. So like the ultra marathoner, they're probably going to require more economy and efficiency and less breakdown of that economy and efficiency over time. Whereas somebody in the middle, like a half marathoner down to maybe like a 10K, like 10K to half marathon, you're probably going to need a combination, like a moderate to high VO2 max along with a pretty high second threshold. And we see that with like the best marathoners in the world. Their VO2 max is pretty high, but then their second threshold is right butted up against that VO2 max. So I've also made a few posts about that where it's like, like what proportion, like your performance is dictated by VO2 max versus economy versus your zone 2 versus your threshold. And the answer is it depends on the distance of the race. The further out you get, the more reliant on where that zone 2 is, or, the kind of your aerobic base is going to be plus your economy. The shorter the race, the more reliant you're going to be on a little bit more of that, like a maximal aerobic engine, like your VO2 max.
Got it. So then let's say we have someone who is training for their first half or first full. I know they're a little bit different, but just let's say their first half and they're just starting training today, this week, or recently. What changes will happen in their training or through their training in their body? And also, is it like, how trainable is it that, like, let's just say, for example, I know people don't do this, but let's say they did half marathon in week 1 of their training in 2.5 hours. Is there much trainability, or is it like genetically predestined, or they can only get down to a certain amount of time? Just for context, right? Conor Mance recently did an interview with, I'll attach it in the show notes after and it'll come to me. But basically, he said that he did his first half marathon in an hour 14 when he was like 12 or 13.
Yeah.
And now he is down to like 59 minutes. minutes.
Yeah.
So he's dropped 15 minutes in his time. And then I was thinking of myself, my first half marathon, 1 hour 45, my most recent 1 hour 29. So I was like, I'm as good as Conor Mantz. I've dropped 15 minutes in my half marathon.
Improvement wise, right?
Improvement wise, the
Yeah,
time
yeah.
wise. Yeah. So yeah, just kind of got me thinking about how trainable are people, what is going on in the body when they're building their endurance for a half marathon.
Yeah, a lot of things are going on in the body when you're training and adapting. We'll get to those really quickly. So from a trainability standpoint, I think the way that I think about it is your ceiling of potential is dictated by your genetics. So somebody with really good genetics might be that sub 2 hour marathon or that sub 1 hour half marathoner, for example. Somebody else, who like maybe parents didn't really run, they didn't run when they were really young, like those sort of things. Their genetic potential might be a little bit lower. Maybe it's 130, for example, or maybe even 2 hours. But I think the trainability is pretty similar for everybody across the board. And what I mean by that is there are some studies that I was looking up when I was doing a podcast interview about like VO2 max and trainability of VO2 max, because we always, like people are always like hand wavy being like, oh my gosh, your VO2 max drops X percentage per 10 years, from the age of 40 onwards. But so that means that your genetic potential for VO2 max might go down because your heart just can't beat as fast. Like you're just not as quick, you kind of lose connective tissue, maybe a little bit of, like kind of that strength power, like those sort of things. But the trainability, so then there was a study that looked at, okay, well, if we take sedentary individuals from, 20 to 30 years old, 30 to 40, all the way up to 70 to 80 or 80 to 90, the trainability of VO2 max was the exact same for all of them. And I can't remember the exact percentages, but it was one of those things where it's like, wow, so the trainability is still there. It's just the genetic or the potential is lower. So I would say trainability is probably similar. It's just where you can get to is going to be limited by your genetics. So, and the good news is that it takes a really long time to reach your genetic potential. So if you've only trained for one half marathon and you only did an 8-week training block for it, chances are you can get a lot better with that consistent training over time. So don't limit, and I don't like when people use that like genetic potential as like a limitation. Oh, well, my genetics just aren't good enough, so therefore I'm not going to train. It's like, yeah, but you didn't realize your genetic potential because you didn't train consistently enough for long enough. So I think it's a little bit of a crutch, and I think it's used, to use as an excuse, sometimes is like, well, have you fully maximized your performance, your potential? Now, going to the adaptations that happen, this is where it's crazy. This is, like the bread and butter of my PhD. Okay, well, what sort of adaptations do you get when you start exercise, or when you get a lot of adaptations when you have different dietary interventions like overeating, like kind of what we were talking about offline. So when you first start exercising, the whole mechanism for adaptation is how much stress your body feels within that exercise. So when you first start training, your body, like you go out and your body is like, if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, where it's like the red lights are going off and like, it's like crisis. Your body's like, holy crap, what the hell is going on? And the good news is that if you rest, then you do that, you have like the big red blaring, sort of stuff all around your body. And, your cardiovascular system's going to adapt to a lesser extent. Your like pulmonaries kind of adapt, but you'll get better at, like breathing and those sort of things. Your muscular system is going to adapt. Like if you're not strong enough to run up hills and stuff like that, you're going to get stronger. If your mitochondria aren't, used to using the carbohydrates and the fats that are in your body in order to make ATP, you're going to make more mitochondria. You'll even have more functional mitochondria. So you'll have all of these adaptations that start, and as long as you're recovering a lot, you'll have really big jumps. So this is where, when people first start exercising, their performance goes like through the roof. There's this steep curve of performance improvement, and then it kind of like plateaus out or gets a little bit more gradual. So that's like kind of from a high level perspective, like what's happening. And then, more from like a mitochondrial perspective, let's just take a step back. When you first start working out, no matter what you do, it's going to cause, some like adaptation. It's one of those things where it's like, if somebody comes to me and they're just like, oh yeah, I've never trained for anything. It's like, yeah, just start doing something because it's going to work. Where it gets more challenging is the people who have been training for a long time and they've already built up some of those adaptations and they're on kind of that flatter end of the curve. It's like, okay, now we have to be more specific with what we're training. And this is where, you start to get arguments, and let's focus on are you cool with us focusing on like mitochondrial adaptations to exercise or to endurance exercise? As opposed to like cardiovascular and like, like sort of other, it all kind of ties together so we can kind of go into it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But the cool thing about our mitochondria is there's multiple ways that they can actually adapt. And
just while I think of it, has maybe heard of mitochondria, but they're just like, I think everything's about VO2 max. Why is there a focus on the mitochondria? Why is mitochondria so important? And what maybe are some like secondary or tertiary factors or parts of the body outside of mitochondria?
Yeah. So if we're just starting from, like what systems are important for endurance performance, your breathing is one of them. Your cardiovascular system, so your heart, your blood is actually part of your cardiovascular system, and then all of the vessels, so your arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, all of those sort of things, and then your mitochondria ultimately are kind of like the last step. And all of these processes are involved in oxygen uptake. So breathing is oxygen uptake, oxygen distribution, which is from your cardiovascular system. You have oxygen bind to your red blood cells. Your red blood cells get pumped through your heart, to your periphery, and then ultimately that oxygen gets used at your mitochondria. And it gets used at your mitochondria in conjunction with the breakdown of carbohydrates and fats in order to produce energy. And that energy that is produced allows us to contract our muscles and do the thing that we want to do, whether that's running, strength training, anything like that. But for an endurance sport, it's cycling, running, repetitive movement. From that perspective, endurance training can enhance your heart's ability to more blood. The more blood you can push through your system at once, the more oxygen you can get to your muscles that then get used by your muscles for energy production. You can have expansion of the amount of red blood cells you see within your blood because that carries more oxygen, right? You can have enhancement or increases in the amount of capillaries that you have because ultimately that would allow for the delivery of more blood to the muscle and to the mitochondria. So essentially all these adaptations are working together to try to uptake, transfer, and then utilize that oxygen. And why I'm fat, and then the mitochondria being like that ultimate step for oxygen use is what I'm really interested in. So if you haven't heard of the mitochondria, they're these, they're not a cell or anything like that. They're this thing called an organelle, which is a small, like piece, the muscle cell. And that is
Is a
where
sponge a good comparison? They're like a sponge that sits inside the body.
more, if we think about it more as so you have kind of like a road system, and the road system, getting traffic in and out is kind of like the like the blood delivery or something along those lines. And then underneath that would be like the sewer system, so taking the waste out, moving water around, moving all the things around. The mitochondria are more like that, kind of like pipe network. They're the ones that are then responsible for kind of getting, I'm trying to think, because it's not really like a sponge other than it uses the oxygen. It's like a power plant. Everyone says it's the powerhouse of the cell, right? So it's in what we mean by that, it's taking in all of the nutrients that you're eating or storing on your body, so fats and carbohydrates, and it's breaking it down using oxygen that we're getting from the blood and then making the energy that can then be used to continue to have us contract our muscles. The reason why they're so important is because if we didn't have the ability to use oxygen, you would go to try to do like a run or something like that, and then your body would stop, like you'd essentially max out your ability to make ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Then you just keel over, and then you'd probably die actually, but you'd keel over, and then if everything was able to be resynthesized, no oxygen, then you could get up again, and then you could sprint from there 2 feet, and then you'd keel over. Whereas the mitochondria allow for this like sustained energy production over time. So you're really, really relying on your mitochondria when you are doing an endurance event, whether it's the mile all the way up to an ultra marathon, to make enough energy for you to just keep going. The mitochondria are highly, highly adaptable to the training that you are doing. What I mean by that is, it's like, so Ross, if I asked you, when I say mitochondria, what shape do you generally see, like, from your classes and stuff like that?
Oval with these, like, I think they're called like villi. So it's got like,
Yeah,
yeah, those
cristae,
cristae, yeah.
the vaginations in there.
Yeah.
So
So these
yes,
kind of prongs that stick out. And that's why a sponge was sort of what I was thinking of. But
yeah, that's just one portion of it. So the mitochondria actually are tubes. So in the muscle, there are these like big tubes. Your contractile elements, your actin and your myosin, are kind of laid out in tube-like structures as well. The mitochondria, what they can do is, say they start as like, like a tube this big. Based on the training you're doing, the tubes can get bigger, but then there's also machinery within the mitochondria. They're called like oxidative phosphorylation enzymes. So there are these proteins that do a special thing, which is transfer electrons and then ultimately use oxygen. You can make them bigger,
and
so you can
yeah,
do both.
that
And that's some.
answers, yeah. That so you can train the efficiency
Mhm.
and the size of the mitochondria through more training. That's what happens.
Yes, exactly. You can make them bigger or you can make them more functional or efficient. And different exercise intensities seem to do different things to our mitochondria. And this is where, it gets kind of interesting is, you have one group of people who's like, oh, you should be doing a lot of zone 2 because it's the best way to make your mitochondria bigger. Or you can make them more powerful. If you kept them here and then you added more of these enzymes, you'd be able to use more oxygen. From what I've seen, doing a lot of endurance and volume is important for that. I don't know if specifically zone 2 is the most optimal for that, but doing a lot of volume, which isn't just mileage, it's time and intensity. So I kind of call it load, is like, whatever your load is, your training load, that's going to dictate how big your mitochondria are, and then high intensity work. So high intensity interval training or even sprint interval training is really, really potent for increasing your mitochondrial function.
Efficiency. By function.
Efficiency.
Okay.
So you need both. You can't just do zone 2 training and you can't just do high intensity training, because then you're going to kind of miss out on the adaptations that then allow your body to use oxygen, which is ultimately, my bias is showing here, but that's ultimately what's then dictating your ability to do the endurance performance. So this is where, and one of your questions was, what are your thoughts on the 80-20 rule? It's like, I think that's great. I think it's a good way of us setting up the mindset. Well, you need that low intensity aerobic work to build your volume and build your mitochondria. And along with that, you build the cardiovascular adaptations and those sort of things. But then you also need that high intensity work in order to increase your mitochondrial efficiency. So you need both. And the ratio, let's just say, I think the ratio changes on how much training you have and the ability you have to do like training. So for those of you unfamiliar with the 80-20 rule, it's especially in endurance training, you should do 80% of your training at really low intensity. So like zone 1, zone 2, and then 20% of your training in anywhere from, kind of zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, if you're using a 4 zone. And where this comes from is observations from, at least I think it started in cross-country skiers, where they saw that during certain portions of the season, this is what their training distribution was. And then when we start to look at, like elite level runners, elite level cyclists, we see kind of some iteration in terms of this distribution across a season, whether it's 90-10, meaning you do 90% of your work at low intensities and 10% at high intensities, or 80-20, or there's even some that's like more like 70-30. But the idea is that you need to do low intensity stuff and high intensity stuff in order to kind of maximize the adaptations in your body to the exercise that you're doing. I kind of get a little tripped up as I work with a lot of individuals who don't have a lot of time. And the question is, and I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on this as well, is the 80-20 rule appropriate for somebody who's only training 3 or 4 days a week? My opinion is I don't think so, because what I would like them to do is have, one high intensity session per week, maybe one endurance, long endurance session. So like a long workout. And then, so that would mean that they're doing 25% potentially of their work at high intensity, if we're just basing it around days. Some of my athletes even get away with doing another sort of higher intensity. So that would be like 50% high intensity. But the point is that they're not training 7 days a week or even 6 days a week. So those other days, that low intensity, they're just not training, right? So that's kind of, I try to do like a top down approach where I say, okay, how long have you trained for? If you haven't really done much training, one higher intensity, one longer workout, fill in the rest of your training time. So if you have 4 days a week with sort of stuff just to recover, and then do some strength training, because we know that that's super important actually for running specifically as well. Underneath that, it's like, okay, now with whatever time you have left to train, let's add as much volume through zone 1 and zone 2 training as you can. But if you only have 3 or 4 days to train, then I'd rather you focus on the strength training, the high intensity stuff, and then all of your other stuff is like, oh, try to walk more or take the stairs, or like just move more, because that's probably closer to zone 1, zone 2 and getting more volume than, oh, if I just had you do zone 1 or zone 2 for all of your workouts, as opposed to doing the high intensity and the strength, I think get as far as fast.
Yeah, it makes you think of the theory versus practice, like before there was the theory, there was people who were just running, like ancestral, and our ancestors were running. So your question just makes me think of that first. It's kind of just like, all this theory is great, but it's like, do you think just going out and running and figuring out and, just doing the best you can and learning through your own individual experience is like a really good way to go? Or should you start with this, like, well, we have the 80-20 rule, and then I'm going to break down my week, day one, So yeah, what are your thoughts on the theory versus the practice? Like, because I love the idea that, you, for example, you have the theory and the practice. I also have the theory and the practice. So yeah, just talk a little bit about that, and I'll come back to your question then as well.
Yeah, I think it's all context specific. So the theory here with the 80-20 rule, right, is everybody should be doing 80% of their work easy and 20% hard. But where that theory comes from is also important. That's coming from elite level endurance athletes who have trained probably for years and years and years, first and foremost. They might be training twice a day. They probably train 6 to 7 days a week with very little rest, because they've built up so much tolerance to endurance training that like doing an easy run is actually recovery for them.
For example, like Kiptum or Kipchoge,
yeah,
like retroactively looking back at their careers and be like, how did they get the world record? Oh, they were doing 6 days, double days.
Yeah.
That's kind of where it's coming from, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think it's good to learn from that, but then you also have to take that theory and you have to try to apply it to your own life, your own stress, your own availability for actual training. And I think a lot of the times that's where we kind of miss the boat is we see, talking heads saying, "Oh, you have to do this because this is what the elites are doing." And then we don't remind ourselves, "Hey, I'm probably not elite and I don't have the same amount of time." Also a recovery piece, right? Like the way that seems like the way that like Kipchoge was living when he's doing, 100+ mile weeks for years and years and years on end is pretty simply like he goes, kind of living in, an area where everybody's running, runs, goes home, eats, might do some, like chores and stuff like that around the house. And then he's just chilling. But how many people are fortunate enough to be able to just chill the rest of their day after their workouts as well? I think from that perspective, the way that I kind of visualize all of this is like I start like the top of the funnel. What is the research saying? What are the elite level athletes doing? What are the successful coaches doing? And then what happens is kind of funnel that down. You say, okay, well, anecdotally now what are people saying? So these are kind of more like the N of ones and like those sort of things. And then you're like, okay, well, how does that apply to me? And then what actually works for me. So everything eventually is an N of one experiment, but it's based off of the starting point is always, well, what does the research say is probably the best way to go about this, for example? But then you have to filter it and filter it and filter it. That's why when I coach my athletes, I kind of have, like a general way I approach things, but I always start with an individual assessment. I figure out, what's the stress of their lives? What are they dealing with in terms of, balancing all of this? How much time do they realistically have to spend training and what can they handle? Because, in theory, it's like, yeah, the high intensity stuff is going to give you the most bang for your buck, but some people can't handle tons of high intensity stuff. So that's where, maybe one high intensity day a week and then one long run a week. Or other people are, because they're really good at kind of compartmentalizing, they could do one or two higher intensity things a week with one longer workout a week. And then as you start to build that out to 5-6 days a week of training, then it's like, okay, well, we're capped here because like, back in I can't remember when, but like the history of running, I appreciated a lot. And Steve Magnus talks about that a lot. And he says, well, like the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. That at one point people were doing 4-hour walks every single day. And that's how they thought, to develop endurance stuff. Somebody came along and was like, we have to only do intervals. So they were doing intervals every other day. And then it slowly kind of reached the middle where no coach who actually like understands all this stuff is having their athlete do just easy stuff or just hard stuff. It's a mixture of all of that. And the answer is it depends and it should be individualized.
Absolutely, yeah. Just thinking of like some of the elites as well. It's like I can't think of this East African runner's name, but I'll be able to think of it later on. But basically, this person for the Olympics in the build-up was like, right, 3 months off to camp, the wife kids, I'll see you later. I got to do this, and just lived, ate, and bred running. Like so. And Phelps training 6 years in a row every single day. That's what's recommended, like in air quotes, recommended.
Right.
It's like, okay, how does that apply to a girl who's like 25 and it's just like, right, I'm out of college, I want to stay in shape, I'm going to do a half, but I actually have a
Or
full-time job.
I have a full-time job. I gained 20 pounds, during college and I want to take that weight off. And, like the most I've ever run, continuously is 15 minutes, or something like that. Is like, that recommendation is much different. Myself, I work from home. I have flexibility to go and run. It's also part of my profession. So like I can kind of write it off, as like a business sort of thing, like, oh, I'm experimenting on myself and I'm showing people how to do it. If my body could handle it, then I could conceivably do, 6 days a week and 2 days and other things like that. But
You
my
would.
body can't. I wouldn't because my body can't handle it and my brain can't handle it.
If your brain could handle it and if your body could handle it, would you train 6 days a week?
I think if I was just going for performance, then most likely. I have found that for me, 5 days a week actually works really, really well. But again, if we say, all things aside, if I didn't have a back issue, a hip issue, other things like that, and I could recover from all of it, then yeah, it's pretty cut and dry. The more load, the more volume you have within your training, kind of the more you're able to kind of reach that potential. But again, it's not just about performance, for me at least. Like I'm not going to be a professional runner. It's fun to see where I can be, but also I'm balancing, like my fiance and I just bought a house. We're going to get married in August. I also want to hang out with her and she's not a runner. So we do stuff on the weekends together and during the week. We have, animals and stuff we have to care for. And I'm building a business and then I'm working for another business. And, so trying to find that balance, what's going to give me the most bang for my buck, not leave me and also keep me invigorated to continue to exercise and train while also being better at all the other things and all the other hats that I wear, I think is a really important lens to view endurance training, especially for most of us. right? There's certainly people out there, when I was like, early 20s, mid 20s, I was like, yeah, the only thing that matters is just running fast. And at that point, yeah, I was doing 70, 80 miles a week, and that's all I cared about. And, but I didn't have a significant other. I didn't, I wasn't really doing much else other than purely pursuing the running game. But now it's different because priorities.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to the question about like applying the 80-20 rule to someone short on time, and when I think about that, I think of like, let's just say they can only train 4 times a week. It's expectations for me, so setting, okay, using those elite examples and then referencing how much time the actual individual has available, the other stressors they have in their life, how important the goal is to them, kind of just going more the sports psychology route and the mindset and just being like, yeah, this half marathon is not the most important thing in my life. And as a result, I have to temper my expectations. But if it was, who knows where I could go, but it's not. So yeah. And it's like the unsexy kind of answer, or no one wants to talk about like, I can't be the best, but it's like, yeah, you can only go, maybe your PR in the half is 2 hours.
The point is like, well, how can we make you the best possible based on the constraints that you have? And I think I always encourage all my athletes to like, tell me the boundaries that you have, because training is going to look a lot different. It's like single guy who, works from home most days and has, afternoons open versus like a dad who, is like hanging out with his kids, taking his kids to sports and those sort of things, also working full time, also, like doing everything that they have to do. Right. And I think, like you said, just setting the expectations early on is really important. You can still kind of try to fit the 80-20 rule. It's it's just boundaries or guide, right? Like we said, that's the starting point. And then kind of go from there. Like, and then, like people get really, really granular. They're like, well, is it based on the amount of minutes or is it the time of intensity at that heart rate? So should you get 80% of your work at a zone 2 heart rate or lower and then zone 4 or 5 heart rate or higher? And, then that just gets like, I think that's like way too myopic. It's like, well, one day is hard and then the other 3 days are easy. And then there you go. You have a 75-25 rule. It's pretty close. And chances are you're not doing the whole hard day. You're doing it kind of easy.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, exactly. You should, you gotta have the rest periods and stuff in there as well.
Yeah, just I'm always amazed at people who do like a hard workout and they don't have like a warm up or a cool down, and I'm just like, wow, that's hard. So Phil, we mentioned strength training already, and I'm not sure if you program that in with your own clients or if you do that yourself, but just talk about, somebody who's doing, let's say, the half marathon training and they incorporate strength training. What effect does that have on, if any, on the mitochondria, on the body, on the muscle, on their performance?
Yeah, so try to take a holistic approach to training. So I will work with the athlete to program their endurance, program strength training as we see available and as we see fit. I also do like nutrition sort of stuff. I have a little bit of a background. Like I'm not a registered dietitian or anything like that, but that was part of my PhD, was looking at, kind of these dietary and nutritional interventions for, training. And, like we were talking offline, it's mainly based on, are you eating enough? And then are you getting enough protein? And are you getting enough carbohydrates during like the hard work and the longer work? But from a strength training perspective, the benefits just in general are that the stronger you get, the more efficient you are at running. And you can go about doing this a number of different ways. Probably the best combination is heavy lifting plus plyometric. Heavy lifting being probably rep ranges of 4 to 8 repetitions, compound movements like squat, deadlift, trap bar deadlift, single leg lunges, like the lower body stuff. Like you're if you get your bench up to 400 pounds, it's probably not going to help you run that much faster. But the lower body stuff is really important. Doing it heavy is really important too. A lot of mistakes I see endurance athletes make is they simply don't go heavy enough on their strength training. They try to turn it into another endurance workout where they're doing 20, 30 reps of the same thing. And this is generally why body weight probably doesn't work as well as the heavy strength training, because, even though I'm limited right now, so I do a lot of body weight stuff, but I'll put a weight vest on and other things. And I can do, probably like 20 or 30 reps. So that's more of an endurance style thing versus heavy strength training, which is then going, like we said earlier, what you've done the least is probably going to be able to elicit the most adaptations the fastest. And a lot of the times, if you're an endurance athlete and you haven't lifted heavy weights before and you have good form, lifting those heavy weights is going to lead to a lot of adaptation really, really fast. And then plyometrics are essentially like being explosive, like explosive jumps, explosive hops, like other things like that. It's not doing box jumps until failure, because that is then another endurance activity. Now you just turned these explosive jumps, which are supposed to be as hard as you can possibly do them, to something where it's now an endurance exercise. If we're being honest, most runners are doing a shitload of endurance exercise, right? You're going out and you're running every day. You're doing a lot of the same movement every day. So if you turn everything into an endurance activity, then the adaptations aren't going to be as high as if you actually use it for the purpose that there for, which is fire the muscles as fast as you can, as strongly as you can, because that's going to have adaptations to your neurological system. So your muscles are going to actually be able to contract harder, faster, and more efficiently. It's going to have benefits on, if you're familiar with fiber types, you have slow twitch fibers, which are primarily used during endurance running. As you get tired, you then use a little bit more of your fast twitch fibers, but the strength training uses a lot of those fast twitch fibers and activates them. So it kind of wakes those up a little bit, if we're going to use kind of layman's terms for it. And then if you're able to actually, kind of utilize those a little bit more, then you could start potentially getting a little bit more of like those metabolic adaptations where you're kind of adapting those fast twitch fibers to a little bit more of that endurance phenotype. So they kind of act a little bit more similar.
So going back to talking about what do the elites do and just retroactively like trying to copy them, I don't see a whole lot of elite like marathon, half marathon runners doing, like I've seen, for example, Clayton Young and Connor Mance have uploaded what they do in the gym and they go pretty heavy, but I don't feel like that's been the case like traditionally or historically. Why? And if we're working off that assumption that the elite runners haven't lifted heavy as you're recommending, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if they haven't done that, why have they avoided that? And then let's just say we take, Joe Soap, elite runner, or Mary Blog or whatever, what would they notice if someone who's running started strength training? What benefit would they get?
So I think a lot of the times it could be ingrained in like the culture of like the training. Like if you don't have access to like an elite training gym or something like that, it's really hard to actually lift heavy. I think it could be that. I also think it could be a fear. Oh, well, if I lift weights, it's going to interfere with the running training that I'm doing. So I think that's like rightfully so. Because if you do lift heavy, the first few times you do it, you'd probably look like a baby giraffe.
You feel like I felt like I'd done something wrong. I was like, oh, this is bad.
Yeah.
And then I was kind of like, oh no, this is, I adapted. But yeah, no, I totally get that fear.
Yeah, you're like, I am so sore, I can't even walk upstairs. How am I supposed to like run? So in the short term, it does interfere. It can interfere with your training. So I think maybe that.
I just want to add as well, actually, just one really important point. I think a lot of people, when they start strength training with their running, they're just like, I'm going to increase my running mileage and then I'm just going to do my regular strength training like a leg day.
Yeah.
And I'm just like in shock that people think that's going to work, because it's like your body is just your quads are getting pounded and then you're just going to do your regular leg day, which would wreck your legs anyway. I'm just like, split your 60-minute, 90-minute, whatever your leg workout is in 3 and do it across the week and save, yourself. Yeah.
There's a difference between, say, training for like hypertrophy, which is growing your muscles, training for performance benefit. There's studies out there that have looked at, different combinations of what sets and rep ranges and how much volume you should be doing with strength training. For the most part, it's probably a lot lower than just your average, like let's just go do legs, bodybuilder style for a day. And the rest period should also be emphasized as being longer. The whole idea is that you want the quality of that strength. It's not, you shouldn't be huffing and puffing and feeling a burn in your legs. It's like, oh shit, I don't know if I can lift this, sort of feeling. It's a different sort of type of fatigue. On top of it, I just think that, it's a time thing, right? If this is where having a good coach comes in, like those really, really elite level athletes, they're probably doing some like PT stuff, like sort of prehab sort of stuff, to try to make sure they don't get injured. But they're like, well, I'm already training double days. Where do I add this, like these 2 strength training sessions? How much fatigue is that going to then induce? Because heavy strength training does induce, like neurological fatigue, which then can, again, interfere with your running and those sort of things. But for kind of like now taking a step back to like kind of the everyday individual, you could do something where like, and this is how I like to do it, is I like to do my hard days with a hard workout and strength training. You have to be a little bit careful, especially if you're prone to, like injuries and other things like that.
Why is that? Because I've heard that before, like doing the hard strength and the hard run.
It concentrates the load and the heavy hard stuff into one day. So then you have recovery on the other sides of it. It's purely that. I don't think there's probably some studies that have looked at, like, well, is there a benefit to doing it here versus, like on the same day versus every other day? And actually, I think it can be more detrimental if you kind of stagger it, because if you did a hard day and then rested and then did a strength training day the next day and then did another hard day after that, now this hard day is feeling this strength training, as opposed to if we concentrated it here, maybe reduced, like the actual, well, you'd have to reduce probably the intensity and the amount of time that you're doing it, just time perspective. And from well, I'm already tired, so I can't push it too hard. So actually it's kind of auto-regulating in a sense. And then you get a whole day off where you can do, like your easy recovery ride or run or whatever you want. And then you can come back and do another day where then you do 30 minutes of strength. But the benefit should be is that the stronger you get, the easier those paces should feel. This is always how I think about it. So if and this would never happen, if my squat went from 200 pounds to 400 pounds, but my running 8 minutes per mile, that's not really going to change in terms of like the force requirement to run 8 minutes per mile. But all of a sudden, the percentage of maximal strength just went down by half. So now I'm running at a much lower percentage of my 1 rep max. And from that perspective, well, oh, this feels easier on my body. It's probably demanding from it's the same absolute perspective, but from a relative perspective, it's less demanding. So then on top of that, you should feel like, oh, I feel a little bit lighter and a little bit quicker, even though you're doing the same speed, for example.
Yeah, or I would imagine the recovery after if you compared a training block where you incorporated strength training versus where you didn't, the recovery after that final half marathon or marathon would be quicker because your muscles are more resilient, I would imagine.
Yeah, that too, right? Because one of the biggest things we see in terms of damage and fatigue and other things like that is the eccentric loading. By doing more of that eccentric loading during training, by strength training or running downhill or whatever it is, you make your muscles more resilient to the damage that's going to be there. So hopefully you could bounce back a little bit faster.
Absolutely. And yeah, just something I want to mention about the double days is like, it's really important to pick a priority and be like, right, the running this half marathon is my priority. And I'm just going to do, as much as I can in the gym, but I'm not trying to like PR. Or if I do have a previous PR of, 200 on squat, I'm not trying to like, or I'm not, you might actually surpass that, who knows, but you're not like, the goal is not like I surpass it or it's like a failure. It's like you got to really be like, oh yeah, maybe I'm just going to hold my squat at like 150, for example, throughout and just get as much strength training as I can in because to try and do both at the same time is like a recipe for disaster. Like I would say someone is guaranteed to get injured pretty soon trying to push both, as I have learned in my own training. So
yeah. Unless you modulate the intensity and the volume of both, right? That's the difference between hybrid training and training for a race, right? Is hybrid training, you have two simultaneous goals: get stronger and try to run faster, which it can be tough. But for running, it's like if your primary goal is just to run a faster half marathon, then you have to say, okay, well, what do I need to do in terms of strength training to get the benefits of it, but not have it leak over and hinder my ability to actually run? Most of the time, it's go a little bit lighter or do less sets, something along those lines where it's not as like sexy because you're like, oh, well, I want to PR my squat and I want to, PR my 5K. And it's just really, really, really hard to do that because it's so demanding on your body.
Yeah, it really is. And we would save ourselves a lot of stress and be more efficient if we just picked one, even looked at it like 80-20. Okay, 80% of my effort is going into my running, 20% is my strength training.
That 80%, or because that's what's the most important, right? That's why the 80-20 rule is kind of just like this catchy thing because it can be applied to everything across the board, right? It's like, I like that. I look at all of this through the lens of, well, what's my primary goal? And then what do I need to do in order to maximize primary goal? And then everything else is kind of secondary to that and facilitating, like, kind of lifting it up.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just simplifies everything when we have a primary goal of, okay, the half marathon for 12 weeks, for example. So you mentioned like the eccentric loading and you coach trail runners. So I just want to talk about the comparison between trail running, road running, and treadmill running. And then even you're doing a bit of cycling right now. I think you said you had like maybe a little bit of an injury and cross training. So if we look at someone doing like a 12-week build or 16-week build, and let's just say you have a client who comes to you and they're like, I have the time to do, whatever. I'll do what you tell me, Phil. Just if you want me to run a bit of trail and a bit of road and a bit of treadmill and a bit of bike and a bit of swim as well and a bit of strength training. Yeah, what would you recommend in terms of someone training for a road race and the split of the trail, road, and treadmill, and then other cross training as well?
Yeah, the way that I like to think about it is like the further away from the race, the less specific you have to be. So that's where you can mix in. It's like, it doesn't really matter. It's like run on the treadmill some days, run on the road some days, run on the trails some days. But there are massive differences in terms of like the treadmill is going to feel a lot easier because it's propelling you and you're just kind of keeping up with it, right? And, there used to be this like idea that like, oh, you have to put a treadmill at 1% in order to get the same like metabolic outcomes. But I think that's been like kind of debunked in a sense from like at least a metabolic perspective. It definitely feels different. Like a 6-minute mile feels a lot different on a treadmill than on the road. And then trail running, right, should feel a little bit softer, but depending on how technical the trail is, you also might be going slow and you're, kind of weaving in and out and, like up and down. So like it's a different movement pattern and a less consistent movement pattern. So starting, like early on, it's like you can be less specific. You can also, this is where you could add, like your cycling cross training and your swimming cross training, like other things like that. Then as you start to get more and more specific or more like closer to your race, then it's like, okay, well, let's prioritize prioritize, as long as your body can handle it, 3 days a week of road training, just so you get used to the pounding of the pavement, because that is a much different feeling than just running on trail. And you're gonna give yourself the best ability to perform by doing things the most as specifically as you possibly can, within reason, obviously. So that's like the approach I take from both a training perspective and then, more of a modality perspective as well. Is, it's like you can get away with being less specific further out, but then too, it's like, okay, well, is doing a zone 2 run on the road or on the treadmill, on the trail, or on a bike, well, what's the purpose of the zone 2 run? Is it to facilitate recovery in between kind of harder workouts, or is it actually one of the required workouts of the week? If it's something that's like a big focus, then do it specifically. But if it's just to do recovery, then get on a bike, go on a trail, do the elliptical, just do something, because your body doesn't know the difference between, in terms of physiological adaptations. You will know the difference between if you do your recovery runs on pavement versus if you do it on a bike or something along those lines. And I promise you're not going to lose fitness by doing a recovery run or a recovery ride, you're not going to lose fitness by doing a recovery ride compared to a recovery run, as long as you're going, as long as you're doing what you're supposed to do, which is recover on that day. That's my long-winded answer of just being like, it should go from less specific to more specific the closer you get to your race, especially even from like an elevation perspective. So if you have a race, like the race that I recently trained for was 2.5 miles and 2,500 feet of gain. So it was really steep. It was one of those things where it was like, okay, well, I didn't run hardly any flat roads. It was like, I have a huge hill out in my backyard. During my hard workouts, at least, it was, okay, let's see how much gain we can accumulate. Or one of the workouts I would do was actually on a treadmill. And the reason for that is because I could control the elevation, and I knew what the elevation profile of the race was actually going to be. So I could essentially simulate that race by doing it on my treadmill, like once a week or once every other week. But I wasn't doing that every day. On my easy days, I was just riding the bike. And I was like, okay, now it's time to recover, from the hard workouts that I actually did.
Yeah, it's very key to train for your race that's coming up. Yeah, I love that idea. It's like more motivational. It's like, right, this hill in my training is going to actually lend itself to the race itself. This is literally going to make the race feel more comfortable. Yeah, one thing, Phil, that you didn't mention that's kind of big here in San Francisco is swimming. So somebody like swimming, for me, it seems like a really effective way to get in some cross training. However, obviously there's no load bearing. So it's like, yeah, like, would you ever recommend that someone does swimming as part of a build?
So swimming is going to be the least specific, to all the adaptations of running, because it's primarily, right, upper body, and you're parallel with the ground rather than perpendicular to the ground. So unless somebody really, really likes swimming, I don't like swimming, so maybe that's one of my biases, but I don't generally recommend, doing swimming. I would rather have somebody just like bike, especially for trail running, which is primarily who like the type of athlete that I coach. Trail running, like mountain biking or just, stationary biking, actually have a pretty good crossover in terms of like the types of muscles that are being used and other things like that. So I would rather have, from a specificity point of view, the mountain biking or the stationary biking plus the trail running versus the running and then the swimming. But again, it depends on what the purpose of the workout is. If somebody really, really loves swimming and wants to go and do swimming, and they're like, yeah, this is like just a way of me like relaxing, and I feel like it flushes my body and I feel really recovered, absolutely, I would recommend them doing. I don't even know where the closest pool to me is. It's probably like 45 minutes away. So, like for me, it's just not feasible. But for other people, like I do work with some triathletes. I'm gonna have them do that. But yeah, for running, most of the time, I don't lean that way. And maybe again, that's just my bias, because one of the worst things, in my opinion, is getting up at 5 a.m. to jump in a cold pool and stare at a line for an hour and a half. That doesn't scream fun to me. And I can't even listen to music, because back when I was training for triathlon and stuff, we didn't have any speakers or anything like that could work underwater.
Yeah, that sounds pretty brutal. So yeah, I think that'd be tough for anybody. So wrapping up the podcast here, Phil, is there anything that we didn't go over? Burnout is something that, I've dealt with my running. You've mentioned a little bit. Have you kind of figured out any ways to avoid it? Is it something that every runner it's like a rite of passage to go through? Or yeah, is there any like really good points that you can give to help people to not actually get up that line of burnout in their running?
I don't think it's a rite of passage. I generally think irresponsibility on the side of the coach, or like your coach. So if you are self-coached and you induce burnout, then it's on you. If you get to a point where, in my definition of burnout is like, you're training, then all of a sudden everything just like seems gray. Like you don't want to do anything. You don't want to go and do your workout. You don't want to, hang out with the kids. You don't want to do your work at your job. Like that's kind of, like how I envision workout, is this kind of like excess fatigue or malaise that you feel just from training too hard too often. And I don't think everybody has to go through. In fact, I think a lot of people shouldn't, like the majority of people shouldn't have to go through it. But the best way to avoid it, take your easy days easier. So know the purpose of an easy day. And the purpose of an easy day is to recover enough in order to do your hard days harder. And one of the early signs that you're going kind of down this path of like burnout is that you're not mentally, it takes more and more kind of hype and focus and caffeine and energy and music or whatever it is to do your hard days as hard as you had been doing them.
With the easy day, just if you could be like really clear on like parameters about, because
Yeah.
I feel like it's just not exciting to do like an easy day.
It's not. And that's the problem, right? Is for most runners, we're like, well, if I don't feel like I did something, then it's not worth it. I guarantee you it's absolutely worth it, being somebody who has been burnt out, not only in training, but in career, which then leads to injury, this like kind of, Eeyore sort of, feeling. The single best way to kind of deal with that and have like a goal is to do some level of physiological testing. And this is where, again, like if I have local athletes, I'll have them come up and every 6 to 8 weeks, we'll do like a VO2 max, go through every intensity, from really, really low all the way to maximum. And then from there, we can determine what your training zone should be. They're not this like, well, your age predicted max heart rate is 220 minus your age. And then we do 90%, 80%, 70, 60, 50. That doesn't work for 99% of people. So I do that. I do the physiological testing, and then I can give my athletes, especially the ones who have a propensity to overreach, overtrain, burn themselves out. I can give them a goal and say, your heart rate is not allowed to go above 120 today. And that is the speed that you are going to be capped at. That's 100%. If you hit 120 for an hour today, that is 100% for your workout. Gold star, woohoo, you won. But as soon as you go above 120 and it gets up to 130, 140, just because I was feeling kind of good, Phil, it's like, I don't give a shit if you win a zone 2 recovery workout. That's not going to win a race. That's not going to get you to a PR. What's going to get you to a PR is doing those quality sessions as high of quality as you can and training consistently over time. So the longer you can train consistently, the better off you're going to be, because everything is a volume game. It's a load game, right? It's the more volume you can accumulate over time, the better off you're going to be. So I would rather have those easy days be slightly easier and maybe a little bit more boring. Throw on a movie, listen to a podcast, this podcast, or how many podcasts do you have at this point, Ross?
In the mid 80s, depending on what I release. Yeah.
So guys, you have 80 podcast episodes to listen to, plus shameless plug, I have another 95 that you can also listen to. You have hours and hours and hours of, I was going to say extremely interesting and exciting, but extremely informative podcast episodes that you can listen to that should then take your mind off of the monotony, the zone 2 training. But it's called training for a reason, right? You're not going to Orange Theory. You're not going to CrossFit just to kind of I'm just here to just get blasted. You're here to actually achieve a goal, which is run faster, whether it's a half marathon, a marathon if they're working with you, whether it's a 5K, 10K, mountain bike race, like whatever you're pursuing, if you're working with me. Sometimes you just have to get over the fact that it is a little bit boring, just to kind of be like a little bit of like a tough love coach. And there are ways of making it a little bit more fun. You could do like, if you're on a bike or something like that, every 5 minutes you could do like, I'm going to increase my pace a little bit and I'm going to go a little bit higher than my zone 2, but then I'm going to go back, so then you're at least like, you're still getting the same stimulus. It's just, kind of making it a little bit more because you're adding in those like changes of speed and other things like that. So I would say that's kind of my big takeaway. And then also nutrition and sleep are extremely, extremely important if you're trying to avoid burnout. How I like to think of training adaptations is you can only adapt to the amount of training equal to the amount of recovery that you're getting. So if you're the type of person who's like, I want to train 10, 20 hours a week, but then your recovery would really only allow for 5 hours of training because you sleep 5 hours a day, you don't eat very much. Yes, you could probably do 10 to 20 hours a week for maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks, maybe even longer. Some people are pretty resilient, but eventually that's going to come and bite you in the ass. And you're going to eventually have to fix that because you're going to be burnt out. You could be injured. So I would rather have you train 5 hours because you have the 5 hours of recovery ability and then build it up over time. Because as you get more resilient, as you train more, you can handle a little bit more because the recovery isn't as expensive. And then also work on the recovery and the sleep aspect of things, the fueling and the nutrition and like those things as well.
Amazing. Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight there to prevent burnout. It doesn't have to happen, which is like a really good point. Phil, is there anything you want to mention before we wrap up or link people to any of your work?
If you're interested in, kind of all of the educational side of things, like learning more about, my coaching and other things like that, I conduct most, if not all my business over on Instagram at Dr. Phil Batterson. I have a podcast called Critical Oxygen. You can look it up on Spotify. It's also hosted on YouTube and those sort of things. And yeah, if you have any questions, any clarifications, from this episode, shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'd be happy to, talk about this sort of stuff. So yeah, if you guys have any questions or maybe want us to do another episode on deeper stuff, let Ross know, and I'd be happy to, come on and talk more.
Absolutely. Yeah, we could talk for hours, Phil. This has been really enjoyable, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.